Hello everybody and welcome to this A-level dirt feedback on Coast Inquiry question 1. Just to give you some hints and tips on top of the feedback I've already given you on your assessments. As always, it's really important to read through the feedback that I've given you and to also have a look at the answers that you've given and can you annotate them. Make a note of where you've done well, but also make a note of where you need to improve. So this will really help you going forward into the future. And also make sure that you do look back at these notes and back at this video just to remind yourself of the key areas you need to focus on in future assessments as well. Don't forget you can pause this video, rewind it at any times if you want to just go through and check something. So here we have all of the questions and we'll go through them one by one. On the whole then, this one was done really well. Some of you were relating it to the Faultine model, but the ones that didn't get the marks for this is that you class sort of rocky versus sandy as two different ways to classify it. So you really needed to put the verses in, and that would be rocky versus sandy, 1 point. There are obviously lots of other ways in which you could do it, and I did try and credit as many of those as possible if they were relevant. Again, this one was generally done pretty well, but remember what the key term is, the command word, sorry, describe. So it wasn't just about stating them, it was saying what are the features of them. So a common one that everybody mentioned was the backshore. This is the area above the mean high tide, which is often, rarely acted on by the processes of the sea. And you'd need to give 3 of those for the answer. Now this gets more onto the tricky stuff, and this is where people showed they had great understanding, but they didn't read the question carefully enough. Now obviously one of the key things here is looking at the command word, which is explain. So you needed to link your knowledge and understanding to say how these landscapes were formed. And that brings me on to another point, is what is the meaning of a landscape? Now I stressed this many times in the lesson, the difference between the key terms of landscape and landforms. Landscape is the wider area which will include lots of different landforms within it. And it is critical at A level. You're not writing everything you know, but you've got to be able to pick out the key elements of the question. This was really looking at this idea of concordant or discordant landscapes. And because this is the area where it's easiest to link the geological structure. And again, always turn back to the specification that we can see here. So it's the variety of scales. And at landscapes. Now, when we talk about landscapes, the wider area, we're really talking about these 2 areas, because the micro features, the coastal morphology we're really talking more about cliff profiles, which would be more landscape. Although some of you did bring in cliff profiles on the wider scope of it, so they were credited as well. But when you're doing this, it's explaining why the rocks parallel to the coast create these sort of features within them. When talking about discordant, it's about the differential erosion rates, but it's also very good to make sure that you're giving examples of those as part of your explanation. And as we discuss, there's not just one type of concordant. You have the concordant coastline along the Dorset coast around Lulworth, but you also have Dalmatian coastlines in Croatia, and you also have the half coastlines in Northern Europe and similar coastlines off the east coast of USA. So it's important that you bring in all of your knowledge to that, but you keep it focused on the landscapes. Now to help you, I've included an example of a really good answer that I did like, which showed that it's gone through the specification and it has an understanding of the key terms. The first bit that I really like is this area here. they've actually defined the key terms. Now, you don't necessarily need to do this in the exam to get the marks, but what this does do is frame the rest of the answer, and it will also help you to focus on giving the key information. So this idea of what geological structure is, it's also got some of the key terms you're going to be discussing, and it tells you what coastal landscapes are. So I really like this because it set the scene so well. It then goes on to briefly explain some of the different areas. Now, it's not a full explanation of everything, but they've got examples in there, and they've kind of linked the different geology to the landscapes and the features of them as well. So they've talked about the different classifications of concordant versus discordant, but also the idea of rocky coasts and coastal plains as well. So really developing and explaining in greater detail than just a simple, oh, it's concordant or it's discordant. We're at A level. We've got to go into that higher level of detail and explanation now, without going off the subject. Again, we look at this one, it's very, very similar, but the key to this is this idea of landforms. These are the more specific features within the landscapes. And if we look and interpret the specification, it's really asking you to talk about the cliff profiles. And this is what you can see that we're discussing here. But also it could be talking about the different individual landforms within the landscape. So for example, within a headland, the faults and weaknesses within the geological structure could be eroded to create these different features. And again, we can see how this person has used an introduction to their answer to make sure that they keep focused on there. So you're not expected to do that. But if focusing on the keywords of the question is a problem, then this is a really good technique just to get into to help you focus. And with essays, it's fantastic, particularly if you keep referring back to it, so you make sure you're keeping answering the question. Now, for explain questions within the A-level paper, it's very rare that you would need to go into massive detail on case studies. But if it's relevant to name a case study or to use that case study as part of your evidence, then it is very worthwhile doing. And we went through in one of the lessons some of the different case studies that you could use in different areas for geological structure. These will also be relevant in different areas of the learning that will go on with inquiry questions 2, 3 and 4 as well. So do, where possible, try and include some of these case studies to back up your answers. This one was answered, was a bit of a mixture. There were some really strong answers and some very weak answers. The weaker answers focused on the ideas of you've got hard rock and soft rock, which is far too basic. Very few of you actually went on to explain the lithology. Now, the lithology are the key features of those rock types. So igneous rocks formed because of the magma, the crystallization can often make it quite hard wearing to some types of erosion, but sometimes the crystals and the porosity can lead it open to weathering, but overall erosion rates are slow. And notice how talking about the erosion rates are slow to really address the rates of erosion part of the question here. It's also important to understand the unconsolidated nature of rocks, such as soils and clays, which are also going to be susceptible to weathering and mass movement, because the weathering and mass movement will have an influence on the rates of erosion. If the cliff collapses easily, that's going to be washed away, allowing more of the coast to be eroded. But also some of you were making very sweeping statements. You know, chalk is a hard rock, this is a hard rock. But it's only hard when you consider it next to the adjoining geology. So as you can see there, if you had chalk and clay, then chalk is obviously the more resistant rock, that's going to be forming headlands. But if you've got chalk next to a granite or a slate, then it's going to be much faster eroding, so that might form the bays. And not all chalk is the same. It can be weakened by uplift, there can be folds in it, there can be more bedding planes in it. And so we've got to overcome this oversimplification, which some of you are still working at the moment. Again, linking the permeability to the stability. Now, some of you went straight on to talk about erosion and the impacts of erosion. Whilst not technically incorrect, it wasn't the best focus of this answer. The permeability can really influence the weathering of rocks, thus weakening it, but also can increase the hydraulic lubrication to increase mass movement and slumping. And so it is important. And again, there were some basic misconceptions here where people were saying, oh, igneous rock is non-permeable. Well, no, that's not generally always the case. They can be porous, it can be permeable, and so you have to be very, very careful about it. And remember in the lesson that we did have a look at the slumping and the way that different layers of rock within a cliff can influence the level of stability and mass movement in there as well. So it's well worth going back over your notes to look at that one. This slide from a previous lesson can really help with some of the understanding of the lithology in terms of cliff shape, but also the impact of permeability as well. So if you're not sure on that, please do have a look at this slide in a bit more detail. So this is perhaps one of the more difficult A-level questions, is explaining the value of coastal ecosystems. Now, some of you did a good job in describing sand dunes or salt marshes, but did you comment on the value of them and why they're important? And also look at the key term here, either. Some of you went on to describe both of them, but it was just one of them that you needed to do. So again, reading the question, because in the exam you'd only get credited for one of them. And it's making sure that you do look at this idea of value, and you're using that word within your answer. So you would say they are very valuable in stabilizing the coastlines. You would then go on to say, well, how do they do that? So you're starting to explain the process of the formation, why that makes them able to be more stable. You could also mention the fact that they bring in the rare and valuable habitats. You could talk about the value in terms of resources for tourism, for human use, but also the fact that because these will respond to changing sea levels, these could be an excellent natural protection from sea level rise. And not only do they protect from erosion, but they can also protect from coastal flooding. But we'll do more of that later on in the course. So again, it's making sure that you really do answer the terms of the question, and you are repeating some of the terms in the question. There were some in earlier answers with permeability, and the word permeability wasn't used once within that answer. So it is important that you are taking the words from the question and you are incorporating them into your answer. So the general feedback and key errors. Most of all, your knowledge and understanding is really, really good. It's just about applying it to the question and understanding the finer meaning of key terms like landscapes, lithology, landforms. Really is important that you do focus on the understanding of those key terms so you can answer the questions most effectively. There are some areas that I've highlighted on your feedback on the individual feedback that you do need to go and have a look at as well. But the key is read the question, highlight the key terms, and make sure that you're linking it back to the specification. If you're not sure on these little practice ones, then please do use your notes and use the specification to help you really focus on that. Hopefully you're taking the information in this video and the written information that I've given you on your individual assessments, and you can add these to your notes. Look through your notes if you've got any misconceptions that you need to write up on, and use this to really develop your understanding further. But also, not only is it about the knowledge and understanding of the geography, but it's also about the knowledge and the understanding of how to answer the questions and how to use case studies to develop or to show that level of understanding and apply them and help them with your explanations as well. Thank you very much for watching. I hope you found it useful. See you soon.